Hola, buenos días.
Perdón.
Estamos a punto de comenzar. ¿Qué pasa?
No, pinche. Había mucho taco afuera.
Pero hay un montón de estacionamiento abajo, ¿ah? Ay, ya, siéntate aparte, ya. Are you sure you're in the right room? Are you lost or confused, or did you understand part of that? So when I came to Amsterdam as an experienced cyclist, I asked for a helmet at the bike shop, and the guy just kind of laughed at me. And we kind of looked at each other, and he was speaking one language, and I was clearly speaking another language. But what really is a language? Language shapes our basic understanding of our surroundings and the world that we live in. We use it to communicate with each other. It's a culturally shared experience of place and everyday life. Language is something that we grow up with, and that creates a sense of belonging and connection. For us, cycling is a language. It's a social activity, and it's much more than just traffic cues and infrastructure. It's about hand signals and eye contact and body language. And we use these to intentionally and unintentionally interact with others and our environment to communicate our way through space.
In this country, you all grow up on a bicycle, your parents' bicycle. It becomes natural and just a normal part of life. It's not really a deliberate choice, it just happens. The same way, our spoken languages, when we're fluent, we don't really think about the words we choose. In an environment that is dominated by cycling, the metaphor of cycling language becomes more apparent than it does in our home context, for example, Norway, where I'm from. Few cyclists just meet one another there. But here, at Amsterdam Central, people being fluent and open to the conversations that are happening. The language connects us, and through this constant negotiation between strangers, we find our way. These conversations lead to direct confrontations in everyday settings between people. And we believe that this creates a sense of belonging that transcends other social barriers. Now, language does not simply mirror the world, but profoundly shapes it. So if we think that way about language and cycling being a language, that can change the way we think about education, inclusion, behavior, and the built environment. The language of cycling is transferred from generation to generation. These children right here, they're growing up on the front and back of their parents' bicycle. And they're watching the body language, and they're learning how to interpret the conversation that goes on around them. When they move on to have their own bicycle, they begin to embody that language. They start enacting cycling with their own adaptations and accents, actively evolving the language and adapting it to the challenges that are presented by new technologies or just non-conforming behavior, slang, if you will. Without the transfer between generations, language is threatened or can become lost, as it has in my country, where fewer people cycle now than they did before. Yet there is hope, because language can be taught. A couple of weeks back, we visited Mama Agatha in Amsterdam Zuidoost, and she teaches immigrant women how to cycle. And this really opens up for them to participate in the practice of the language, and they can overcome barriers of being a non-speaker. Now, we believe that everyone can use a language and that everyone should have the opportunity to become fluent. So I cycle with my Norwegian accent and startle all the Dutch people, and I yield in all the wrong places. But I just need a little tolerance in order to change my behavior.
Let's think for an example of George waiting at a stoplight in Eindhoven. George has the option to follow the rules, or George can take his own way, thus deviating from the rules and using his own form of slang. When more as we did, it becomes a common behavior. And this is what we saw on the Visserplain, where slang was a very common thing to notice. The city took this into their design, and rather than expecting cyclists to follow the rule book, they incorporated the slang and adapted the design to it. Now, what's even is predicting what new types of slang will emerge. In my field of transportation engineering, we often assume cyclists and people will follow the path of least resistance. But just like an artist chooses to speak more eloquently, cyclists speak a very rich and subjective language that defines their behaviors and choices. But this language is not known everywhere. And in my home context of Toronto, the bike is seen as nothing but a smaller version of a car. And there's so much more to it. The car seals its inhabitants away from the environment, whereas the bike exposes them, making them a part of the public realm. This is a lively conversation.
So for the last 3 weeks, we've been learning the language of cycling in the Netherlands. And though we'd like to think that we've come a long way, our accents are still quite strong. So this is me without a helmet, but clearly failing to balance. And so the challenge that we all face is translating the Dutch language of cycling into our own home contexts. Our cycling dialects are only in the early stages of development, and it's now our task to nurture these dialects and bring in more people to build a rich and complex cycling dialect. But we also challenge the Netherlands to further develop the Dutch cycling conversation. Language isn't static, and by listening and including new and diverse voices and technologies, you can also ensure that cycling continues to evolve and expand, even here, to ensure that it becomes a part of everyone's cultural identity. So use language as a tool to change our reality.
Use language as a tool to change our reality.